I'm talking with Professor Joseph Huffman. It seems it would be a shame if we're talking about the Middle Ages in history of math if we didn't have an expert who I could walk to in the rain and find out some more about the Middle Ages. And the big concern that I have is that a video that we saw showed a mathematician saying that it was the Dark Ages, and it made my the hair on the back of my neck raise, because I don't know why, but other people call it that, and I don't think it should be. But I thought I'd ask an expert, why do people call it the Dark Ages? And for heaven's sake, what is it if it's not dark? So take it away, Joseph.
Okay. Thanks, Gene. I appreciate an opportunity to address that question and to have a historian actually speak to something about the past rather than a mathematician's account of the past. The Dark Ages is actually a modern invention. It is the creation out of the Enlightenment, which should tell you a great deal about what folks at the time felt they were doing to Western civilization. To be fair, it was a time of revolution, a time of change. There was anti-monarchical attitudes, anti-aristocratic expectations, really a resistance to what we used to call the ancien regime, the old order. And of course, the church was very much a part of the old order. And so we often find a kind of anti-religious sentiment here, and labeling the Middle Ages as being a quote-unquote age of faith. Therefore, it must be rather unrational and backward. So it was rather a self-congratulatory category to describe oneself as leading in the enlightenment of your civilization. Well, coming out of this into the 19th and 20th century, you have a continuation of a kind of reflection on the past, that we are progressing, we are advancing past a dark period. You also have a time of continued neoclassical thinking, looking to the Romans and the Greeks for our models, not looking to the medieval period for our models. And so if you go down and look at the architecture in D.C., you'll see Greek and Roman architecture. You won't see, by and large, Gothic architecture unless you look at churches. And so we have this sort of a continued notion of we should look past the Middle Ages to this classical age. And nothing about the Middle Ages should be classical. Therefore, it's this Middle Age. It's in between them and us. And so it's almost as if we have classical grandparents but no medieval parents. And this is especially true for Americans, whose nation was born in a neoclassical age, an age of the Enlightenment, which believed that we could start anew and did not need to rely on having medieval parents. And so we as Americans rarely think that we have origins beyond ourselves. Well, as this was folded into the growing public educational system in America in the late 19th and early 20th century, you can imagine that a lot of these notions fashioned by folks who were not keen on the Middle Ages as a model for civilization were woven into the curriculum. And these are the folks then that brought you not only George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, because that was a very good civics lesson. Whether it was true or not was irrelevant as history. These folks also brought you the flat earth theory, chastity belts, the witch craze, which, by the way, was actually an early modern event by and large. It was not a big issue in the Middle Ages. The Salem witch trials were actually here in the United States, I believe, not in the Middle Ages. But in any case, witches and anything you could have that bubbled and boiled, you put in the Middle Ages, whether it belonged there or not. And these ideas just stayed in public educational curricula. The progressives of the early 20th century continue to teach a kind of history. Well, frankly, historians basically were removed from public education in the 1920s and 30s, and social studies came in to replace it. All of us are aware of our social studies classes. And so historians don't teach the past. Social studies is the replacement for it, which is sort of overshadowed by a great number of other social sciences. And so there's a kind of instrumentalization of the past in which, if we want to look at how far we've come, if we want to look at how advanced and democratic and enlightened we are, we'll use the Middle Ages as our grab bag of civics lessons to show how dark people's lives and minds were. we tend to overlook the horrors of the 20th century and these sorts of things when we ask those questions. So I'm not offering any special pleading for the Middle Ages, simply trying to suggest that our relationship to it has been very complicated, not so much because of the Middle Ages, but because of modern generalizations, which reflect more about modern concerns than anything about the actual Middle Ages. I should also say that there was also a polar opposite movement known as the Romantic era in the 19th and early 20th century, which thought the Middle Ages was really cool. They were concerned about the growth of mass society, the growth of industrialization, the loss of farming life and rural society. And so the Middle Ages was seen as this golden age of faith, this golden age of, and this word's coming back these days, of organic society rather than manufactured industrial mass society. And so I would just say that in terms of the history, not so much the math, but the history of all this, the Dark Ages and this Romantic Age, these are two visions of the Middle Ages that tell us little about the actual Middle Ages. They tell us more about our imaginations and the kind of Middle Ages we need as a mirror to tell us who we think we are.
Well, that's good. So now say something good about the Middle Ages.
Well, do you want me to talk a bit about like mathematics in the Middle Ages in terms of some of that?
Sure.
I don't know if you're covering it in the
talking
class.
History, so you have the right to talk math. It's only
Okay.
fair.
Well, I'll be brief on this, and I'll kind of give some of the highlights. I mean, we're talking about a time period from roughly 500 to 1500. It's 1,000 years. I can't possibly do justice to that. But I would say just a few things. Throughout the early Middle Ages, we don't have sort of mathematical scholars, but mathematics is really everywhere in at least learned circles. The need to calculate was critical. For example, simple things that needed to be done were calculating Easter. How did you know when Easter was going to be in a given year? That is a movable feast. That was attached oftentimes then to astronomy. And we have, as moderns, lost connection with the stars and the movements of the planets. We tend to find those curious guys who get on TV and tell us what's going on once a month on PBS, and we think we've learned about the stars. But they really, throughout the Middle Ages, really looked to the heavens to orient themselves. It really was a way of placing yourself in the universe. You couldn't really travel without knowing where the stars were and where the planets were and what season it was because of what the skies told you. So astronomy and generally the need to calculate. Early medieval folks called it computus, the need to calculate. So I would say math was used in very pragmatic ways in the Middle Ages. You don't have great theorists necessarily, but they're very practical uses. The third area in which math is very important, and it may seem a little odd at first, but it is music. Because of liturgy and worship, music was very, very important and was considered to have kind of spiritual aspects to the rhythms and the mathematics of music. And so music was always folded in with astronomy in terms of mathematical study. In fact, I would say that one of the areas that is classical that continues throughout the Middle Ages, uninterrupted, are the traditional 7 liberal arts. And so I'm sure maybe you've touched on the trivium and quadrivium. The quadrivium is the, shall we say, the quantitative end of the curriculum. And here you study all the quantitative ways of knowing. And so music and astronomy were 2 of those 4 liberal arts, but I must stress that 2 other of those 4 quadrivium liberal arts were arithmetic and geometry. And so any learned person, anyone with a sound basic education, studied arithmetic and geometry. So this carries through primarily through monasteries preserving this classical learning until the 12th century, when we start to see the rise of universities. This liberal arts model of the trivium and quadrivium, these 7 liberal arts disciplines. By the way, the trivium was grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Here you have kind of the humanities end of the curriculum. And so as universities began to form, and by the way, the university is a medieval invention. It's hardly a dark act, I think. And we have kind of the opportunity. We don't have any public educational systems in those days, but we have the possibility to educate a much larger mass of people for the growing needs in the professions of a very complex urban society by the High Middle Ages, by the 12th, 13th century. And so in the universities, we have to hire a lot of scholars who are going to teach basically the bachelor's degree. And it's the same as we have here at Messiah. And so you hire a number of mathematicians who made a living as educators and became pretty significant mathematicians in their own right. The first connection that you find in the universities in terms of mathematics is conversations with Muslims, with the Islamic world. Here again, a fascinating kind of interchange that one never tends to think of when they think of the Middle Ages, certainly if they call it the Dark Ages. For example, Adelard of Bath, who lived, was productive in the early 12th century, traveled throughout Syria, throughout Palestine. He learned Arabic while on his journeys, and therefore, talking with intellectuals in the Arab world, discovered that they had actually preserved a lot of the classical Greek texts of mathematics in Arabic. So here's the interesting thing. Medieval European scholars learned about the Greek texts of geometry, whether it's Euclid or Ptolemy and so on. They learned of those texts through Arabic. And so they had to be translated into Latin so Western scholars could use them. So people like Adelard of Bath, people like Gerard of Cremona, spent entire careers studying with Arabs, learning the language. Gerard was in Spain and spent most of his life there, learning Arabic and then translating all the classical corpus of mathematics. Primarily Euclid. I would say, in fact, Adelard's translation of Euclid was the standard textbook, if you will, for mathematics, for geometry, at least in the West, for the entirety of the Middle Ages. Adelard wrote about the astrolabe. Notice again the connection with astronomy. The abacus and the ways of calculating, learned all of these skills as well. You may well have mentioned, I imagine, Al-Khwarizmi, the great mathematicians in the Arab world, and so these folks are busy translating his texts. They were bestsellers at the universities. I don't think I need to say anything about Fibonacci. You're probably going to spend a lot of time on him. So you folks all know what his contributions were. I'll skip him altogether. Okay. But I will say, his father was an ambassador, and Fibonacci actually was educated, grew up in North Africa. So again, you see these multicultural kinds of connections that were going on in the Middle Ages that most people don't seem to be aware of in our day. Jordanus Numerarius is another person that comes to mind, early 13th century now. And again, I want to stress that mathematics in the Middle Ages was very practical and not as much theoretical. And so Jordanus was quite involved in mechanics. He'd be sort of like in our engineering program if he were here. But he taught at the University of Paris in the area of mechanics. Jordanus solved the problem of the inclined plane, which eluded Archimedes. So here again we see an advance on some of the classical mathematics of the Greeks. Perhaps the most important person for my thinking is Nicholas of Orême, a late 14th century French mathematician. He was very much involved in physics, applying his math in the area of physics, and much of his physics actually laid the groundwork for people like Newton and Leibniz, but most people aren't aware that he ever existed. Coordinate geometry he developed before Descartes did. He worked in infinite numbers, which has lots of philosophical implications, as you can imagine. And I should also say that, again, no one thought there was a flat Earth. In fact, Nicholas actually opposed the theory of a stationary Earth that Aristotle had developed. Indeed, Nicholas taught the motion of the Earth 200 years before Copernicus did. But again, we rarely hear that. In Oxford University in England, there developed a school of thought called the Merton School, really at Merton College, in which a great series of numbers of mathematicians developed. Very much, again, interested in physics. Thomas Bradwardine is probably the most important figure, although I could, if I had the time, talk about at least a dozen mathematicians. Now, Thomas Bradwardine developed the laws of motion and velocity before Galileo. Galileo made use of Bradwardine's work. However, if you open a modern-day physics textbook, you'll still see Galileo being given credit for this work. Now, this is part and parcel of the ignorance of the medieval period, just being written off as dark and giving credit only to early modern and modern people. The final person I would mention in sort of my, if you will, Hall of Fame of medieval mathematicians would be Jean Buridan, was a very important 14th century French mathematician. And he developed the theory of, I guess I would call it impetus theory, and the issues involved of inertia. This became very important because Copernicus could not have accomplished his work without Buridan's theory about theorizing how heavenly planets and objects could have moved through space. Right. So those are all people who clearly contributed to the mathematical tradition of the West, and laid the groundwork for people like Galileo, Newton, Leibniz, and others. Again, in very pragmatic, applied math kinds of ways, and Fibonacci then, obviously, in theory. Again, people like Galileo just don't perk up out of nowhere, and we love the grand person theory of history that someone just comes out of nowhere and transforms the world. And frankly, that's rarely the case. He has a great mind, but he had a great tradition that he drew from. Same could be said for Leibniz, Newton, and others. Anyway, so those are some people I would say that I got your email. I scratched some thoughts out last night before I went to bed. These are kind of the big names, but there are many, many more if you ever wish to study them. Well, I don't really find it my business to make apologies and say, well, please take the Middle Ages seriously. I think rather I would make as ignorant of statements about math if I were asked to speak to actual mathematics, as a mathematician might to a period of history that they don't study. And so it's a matter of just specialists talking to each other more. And that's why I welcome this opportunity to do this.
Good. Thank you. In fact, we just finished talking about Fibonacci today.
Ah, good.
And we are going to be talking about Orême in about another couple weeks.
Yeah.
So
we've set the table.
yes, and I appreciate that very much. So thank you.
Sure.
And I'll see that you get a copy of this.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great. Thank you. Enjoy your class.